Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's good to be back. Have you been?
I'm doing well, thanks. Ready for this one? We've been deep in the hardware for a few weeks. Memory, perception.
Hard wiring, right.
Today, I think we're shifting to the central operating system. We're looking at freedom, self-control, and what it really means to be, well, sovereign.
Yes, and this isn't just a philosophical chat. We're going to be examining the cognitive structures themselves, the ones that underpin personal independence and even collective self-determination, which is a kind of mastery, isn't it? You might call it Egemenlik.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really unpack what true human freedom, this idea of özgürlük, what it actually requires.
Because it's so often confused with just, simple liberty.
But the sources suggest it's much more demanding. It's about limits, discipline, and maybe most importantly, mastering our own impulses.
Okay, so let's start right there. Let's just dismantle the biggest misconception out there.
The one you hear everywhere.
Exactly. You ask anyone, what is freedom? And the answer is almost always some version of doing whatever I want.
Acting on whatever thought just pops into your head. Freedom without any friction.
And that lack of fiction is precisely the problem with that definition. I mean, if freedom is just following every single impulse, every desire, it has no structure. It has no integrity.
It becomes what the source called a potentially damaging privilege.
It does. It really does.
I remember in school, the definition we all learned was something like, freedom is doing what you want as long as you don't harm others. Why is that not good enough for defining human freedom?
Well, because that definition doesn't really separate us from the rest of the animal kingdom, does it?
How so?
I mean, think about it. Any animal that avoids a predator is free in that sense. An animal that harms another pays a biological price paying, maybe getting kicked out of the group. That's a kind of primitive justice system.
So that cost and consequence system already exists in nature.
It's everywhere. So for human freedom to be a genuine cognitive achievement, it has to be something more than that, something beyond that basic level.
Okay, so if that animalistic definition is out, where do we find real human freedom?
It's in the internal veto. That's the key. True freedom is the ability to master your own impulses.
To consciously choose not to act.
Yes. Even when the desire is strong and the opportunity is right there, it's about becoming independent from those base desires.
That just flips the entire paradigm on its head. So freedom isn't about the capacity to do something.
It's the capacity to refrain. Precisely. I mean, think about it. If you're basically a slave to a chemical signal in your brain, the urge to check your phone, the impulse to eat that cake when you're on a diet, you are not free.
Right. It doesn't matter how many external liberties you have.
Not at all. You're just reacting. You're not choosing. So this independence from our own internal noise, that's the foundation of any real self-mastery.
And this seems to bring us to the role of limits, which sounds like a paradox at first.
It does seem that way.
We think of limits as restriction, but you're saying they're actually essential for freedom.
Well, we have to start by just admitting the limits we already live with, right? We have biological limits.
Yeah.
We can't fly. We can't hold our breath for an hour.
And social ones too. You can't live in total isolation and thrive. You certainly can't please everybody all the time.
Recognizing those external objective limits is just smart. But the really interesting part, the core of this, is the ability to set internal boundaries.
That's where the freedom comes from.
That's where it is. A person who sets no boundaries for themselves is instantly compromised. They're enslaved, really, either to their own nature or to the constant demands of the outside world. They just become a victim of circumstance.
So the actual mechanism of freedom is when someone sets a long-term goal, which is a self-imposed limit by definition, and then they consciously put off the immediate gratification.
They delay the pleasure. They sacrifice that small temporary feeling that has to move toward a much bigger objective.
It's like the difference between dreaming about a vacation and actually planning one.
That's a perfect analogy. In the dream, you have total freedom. You can teleport, you can fly, but it doesn't get you anywhere real.
Right.
To actually go on the trip, you have to impose limits, a budget, a schedule, an itinerary. Those boundaries don't restrict the goal, they're what make the goal possible. The boundary is the delivery system for the freedom.
That makes perfect sense. And self-mastery, this idea of setting your own rules for your own good, that must be what enables real independence, or bağımsızlık, to actually happen.
It's the natural result of it.
Right.
When you're internally free from impulse and externally free from just reacting to everything, you can actually realize your purpose.
And this builds toward the concept of sovereignty, Egemenlik. Now, that word implies more than just being independent. It suggests Mastery, competence, being in control, or hakim olma.
Yes, sovereignty, whether for a person or a nation, means you know what needs to be done and you have the skill and the information, the bilges and basery, to do it. You don't just get the right to rule, you have to have the competence to rule wisely.
And if we scale this idea up to a whole society, it becomes so clear why collective freedom can't just be everyone for themselves.
Because that's a regression. It's going back to that animalistic state. It's just chaos or anarchy or the powerful dominating the weak.
So true collective freedom needs something bigger.
It needs a great shared ideal, a mefcure. And that shared ideal means we all agree to certain rules for social cohesion, for order.
So the phrase, sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation, that only works if the nation is wise enough to maintain that order and focus on those long-term ideals.
Exactly. A sovereign people is one made up of individuals who have enough self-mastery to put the well-being of the whole group above their own immediate personal gains.
Let's bring it back to the personal level for a moment. What about our internal experience? We often think that feeling free means we are free. How reliable is that feeling?
Feelings are really just a sophisticated detection system. That's all. So when you feel resistance or you hit a wall, that feeling isn't a final judgment, it's just data.
Data that signals what?
It signals one of two things. Either this is a challenge you need to overcome to grow, or it's a warning sign that you need to change course before you fall into some kind of addiction or dependency.
So feeling restricted doesn't necessarily mean your freedom is being taken away?
Not at all. It might be the very signal that freedom is required of you, that you need to reflect and make a conscious choice.
And that reflection ties directly into responsibility. I was fascinated by the linguistic roots here. In Turkish, sorumluluk, or responsibility, comes from Sual, question.
Responsibility is the ability to respond, the ability to answer.
Which means our intellectual area of responsibility is, well, almost infinite. You can ask me about the Andromeda Galaxy and I can at least answer, I don't know.
But here's the crucial part that requires wisdom. You have to know the difference between what's in your area of responsibility and what's actually within your authority, your sphere of influence.
And people mix those up all the time.
All the time. And they become totally ineffective. Think of someone who pours all of their emotional energy into, say, their favorite sports team, the kind of group responsibility.
They feel they have a deep duty to the team's success.
Exactly. But in doing so, they neglect their actual authority, their family, their health, their job. They trade their real individual freedom for the feeling of belonging to a crowd.
That's a powerful and slightly uncomfortable point, which leads us, I think, to the biggest debate of all. The challenge to free will itself.
Ah, yes. The idea from neuroscience and psychology that our actions might just be predictable, deterministic.
We have to talk about the readiness potential, the RP, that brain activity that comes before a movement.
Right, and the classic Libet experiment, which everyone cites.
And what it found, famously, was that this brain activity, this RP, would fire seconds before the person consciously decided to, say, move their wrist. So the decision seemed to come after the brain was already getting ready.
Which is a huge challenge to the idea that our conscious will initiates everything. It suggests many of our actions are, well, pre-conscious. They surface into our awareness after the process has already begun.
There's a part of that experiment that gets overlooked, isn't there? The really profound counter-observation.
This is the critical part. They found they could not predict when a person consciously decided to refrain from the action, when they vetoed it. The ability to say no to an impulse that's already in motion, that remains unpredictable.
And that is the absolute core of our cognitive freedom, the veto.
It's not about starting the action, it's about consciously suppressing it.
And the language you mentioned earlier captures this perfectly. It makes a distinction between two kinds of will.
It does. There's ATR, which is the will to select something and act on it, the choosing and the doing.
And then there's Irade,
which is the specific will to refrain, the choice not to do something. And that right there is the highest expression of human freedom, the ability to override a powerful biological signal.
like fasting, for example, the practice of a ruse. It exists in almost every culture.
Of course it does, because a hungry animal can't just choose not to eat food that's right in front of it. That self-veto, putting a higher ideal before an immediate demand, that is uniquely human. And it's not passive, it's the most active kind of internal work we can do.
It's where our will is actually built. And like a muscle, that Irade needs to be trained.
You need consistent training, yes. If you never practice saying no to the small things, you'll have no strength when the big temptations arrive.
So if this self-mastery is the definition of freedom, how does this all connect back to happiness, to Matluk?
Well, first we have to define happiness correctly. It's not about your external situation, your wealth, your job.
It's an internal state.
It's the state of being content with your life, or being able to look back at everything you've experienced and say, I accept this.
And the data on this is very clear. People who feel like they're in control, that they're at the steering wheel of their own lives, they report much higher levels of happiness.
Even when they make mistakes.
Right, because they accept responsibility. They chose the path. If it was wrong, they can choose to correct it. It creates this incredibly powerful positive feedback loop.
It does. It enhances both their freedom and their happiness at the same time. You can't find that deep satisfaction if you believe you're just a product of things happening to you.
So to wrap this up, if individual mastery is the root of personal freedom, what's the final warning for us on a collective scale?
It's that sovereignty is fragile. The huge potential power of a nation is just. It's wasted when its people become fragmented, when they get lost in thousands of tiny personal agendas and lose that shared long-term story.
So if everyone is just obsessed with the day-to-day political drama, who won the last argument?
All that energy is just burned internally. It creates noise, not progress.
Yeah.
Real progress requires citizens who could overcome their own immediate ETR, their desire to just act selfishly and focus on the greater common good. The goal has to be to cultivate wisdom or hikmet in the population.
So sovereignty isn't a right you're given. It's a condition you have to constantly earn through shared wisdom and purpose. It requires constant questioning.
Which brings us to the final thought we should leave everyone with. If the development of this veto, well, this Irade, is the highest form of personal freedom, what values are we actually prioritizing for the next generation?
Because what we are teaching our children today is, without question, what will define the nation's future tomorrow.
The whole focus has to be on raising wise individuals who are capable of focusing on grand, shared ideals, not just distracting them with temporary squabbles. If they don't develop that internal mastery, any sovereignty they inherit will just become a memory.